Garrett Cole had read the ground wrong only once in 22 years of fieldwork, and that mistake had cost the copper company $4 million and cost him 6 months of sleep. He didn't read the ground wrong anymore. He trusted his instruments, his core samples, his methodology. He trusted the data. The data, when he arrived at the ranch in late August, said nothing useful at all. Roy Harlan met him at the gate in a truck that had seen better decades. 60s, lean, a face like weathered sandstone, all flat planes and deep-cut lines. He shook Garrett's hand with the kind of grip that measured rather than greeted. "Drove all the way from Salt Lake," Roy said, not a question. "4 hours." Garrett looked out past the fence line. The Uinta Basin spread flat and enormous in the afternoon heat, sage gray and rust red, the kind of landscape that made you feel small in a way that had nothing to do with its actual dimensions. "You said the phenomenon is nocturnal?" "Mostly." Roy opened the gate. "Come nightfall I'll show you. Till then I'll show you what the last geologist left behind." The last geologist had left behind 3 weeks of careful notes that stopped mid-sentence on a Tuesday, a laptop with a cracked screen, and a core sample case with every sample intact and labeled and never submitted to any lab. Garrett sat in Roy's kitchen going through the notes, while Roy made coffee that smelled burnt and strong. The work was good, solid methodology, clear observations, no obvious errors. Dr. Renata Voss, independent contractor, experienced. Her handwriting was steady for the first 2 weeks. Then it changed, not dramatically, just a slight loosening of control, letters that leaned wrong, words occasionally repeated as if she'd lost her place in the middle of a sentence. Her last entry read, "The blue is not coming from the rock. The blue is going into the rock. I think the rock is..." "She quit?" Garrett asked. Roy set the coffee down. "Suppose so." "You suppose?" "She wasn't here one morning." He said it the way people say things they've decided not to think about too hard. Garrett drank the coffee and watched Roy's face and said nothing. He set up his instruments in the depression 200 yards east of the main house, where Roy said the phenomenon was strongest. The ground here was slightly lower than the surrounding terrain, as if it had been compressed, though no geological event he knew of could account for the shape. The rock at the depression's center had a color he didn't have a name for. Not quite rust, not quite brown, the kind of color that might be what something else looked like after a long time of being eaten. He took his first core samples before dark. The drill went in smoothly for the first 4 feet. Then it stuttered, caught on something that gave way too easily, like pushing through wet cardboard. He pulled the core and looked at it under his field lamp. The mineral composition was consistent with the basin's geology: sandstone, mudstone, carbonate layers, what you'd expect, but threaded through the lower section of the core, running parallel to the stratification like veins in marble, were filaments, pale, almost translucent, thinner than his thumbnail and branching at irregular intervals, like capillary structures, like something that had grown rather than formed. He photographed them, labeled the sample, told himself it was fungal intrusion, which happened, which was documented, which was explainable. He told himself this while looking at the way the filaments caught the light, held it almost, kept it for a moment longer than the surrounding rock before releasing it. He put the core down and picked it back up twice. The second time, he brought it close enough to smell. It smelled like nothing, not like rock, which has a smell, mineral, cold, honest, not like anything biological, just absence. The smell of a space where smells should be, cleaned out and waiting. He said it with the others and zipped the case and stood up, and his shadow stretched long across the depression in the last of the day's light, and he noticed, without wanting to, that the ground directly beneath his feet had a faint warmth to it that the surrounding rock did not. The sun finished going down. The blue came up from the ground the way water rises in a flooded basement, slowly, with complete indifference to whether you were ready for it. It was beautiful. He hated that it was beautiful. It rose from dozens of points across the depression, Not bright enough to read by, but bright enough to see. A cold blue-white that had nothing of fire in it. No heat, no flickering, just a steady, breathing glow that pulsed maybe once every 4 seconds. The pulse moved through the ground the way a heartbeat moves through a chest wall. He checked his instruments. Radiation normal. Electromagnetic, a faint anomaly, well within safe range. Gas emission nothing. He pressed his spectrometer against the rock at one of the glow points and watched the readings and felt, for the first time in 22 years, that his instruments were politely declining to be useful. The light was not phosphorescence. It was not bioluminescence. It matched no known emission signature in his reference database, which was comprehensive and current. Whatever produced it was doing so through a mechanism he had no category for. He sat in the blue-lit dark and wrote in his field notebook and tried to think clearly. An old woman was standing at the fence line. He saw her when he looked up. She was on the far side, maybe 30 yards out, very still. Ute, he thought, though he couldn't have said from this distance what his instinct was based on. She was watching him the way you watch something you've watched before. He raised a hand. She didn't move. "You shouldn't be out here," he called, cautious, not unfriendly. She said something he couldn't quite make out over the distance. He walked toward her, and she didn't move, and when he was close enough to hear, she said it again. "The ground is eating." He stopped walking. "The blue light," he said carefully, "is a geological. The blue light is what comes out of something when it eats." She said it without drama, a fact stated for the record. The people who lived here before the fences knew this land was hungry. That's why they didn't live here. The Ute? The people before the Ute people. She looked at the depression behind him. The blue pulsed in the ground like something breathing beneath a thin blanket. The blue is not the thing. The blue is the waste of the thing. He stood very still. "What's the thing?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Something old," she said. "Something that was here when the rock was young. It sleeps for a long time and then it wakes and it eats until it sleeps again." She paused. "It has been awake for 11 years. What does it eat?" She didn't answer that. She looked at his hands. He looked at his hands. In the blue light rising from the ground, very faint, like a watermark held up to a lamp, the same filament structures from his core sample were visible under the skin of his right hand, tracing the lines of his tendons, following the small bones of his fingers. He turned his hand over. The back was worse. The filaments there ran close to the surface, close enough that he could see the faint branching pattern he recognized from the core sample. Too regular, too deliberate. His skin looked the same, felt the same when he pressed it. But something underneath was quietly, patiently rearranging itself, and had been for long enough that it was no longer hiding. He made a fist, opened it. The filaments moved with him the way his own tendons moved with him, already fluent in the language of his hand. He looked up and the old woman was walking away into the dark. He should have left that night. He knew it. The part of his mind that had kept him alive through 2 decades of fieldwork in bad conditions was telling him clearly and without ambiguity that this was the moment to pack his instruments, write a professional decline letter to Roy Harlan, and drive back to Salt Lake. He stayed because he needed to understand what he was looking at. This was the flaw in him, the one he'd always known about. The need to understand was stronger than the instinct to survive. It was the thing that made him exceptional at the work and that would, he had always suspected, eventually kill him. He spent the next day mapping the fissure. It was hidden in the lowest part of the depression, covered by a slab of displaced rock that looked natural until you moved it. 4 feet by 3 feet, irregular. He shone his light down into it and saw nothing but depth. More depth than he could imagine. He lowered his camera on a cable and watched the feed on his tablet. Rock walls going down farther than the cable could reach, and below the reach of the cable, at the limit of the light, movement. Something vast and slow. Something that wasn't swimming because swimming implies water, implies known physics, implies a world with rules he recognized. Something feeding. He pulled the camera back up. He sat with his back against the warm rock and looked at the image on the tablet, frozen on the last frame, the dark below the light, the shape that was only just a shape, and tried to organize what he knew. What he knew, the filament structures in the core samples were not fungal. They were, structurally, too complex, too organized. They branched with a logic he didn't have vocabulary for but that his pattern recognition kept trying to call purposeful. They ran through the rock in a network, not randomly, in a network. What he knew, 11 years of documented phenomena on this ranch. Lights, missing animals, equipment failures, the previous geologist who wasn't here one morning. What he knew, the filaments were in his hand. He pressed his thumb against his palm and felt nothing unusual, no pain, no foreign sensation. But when he held his hand against the sky, against the flat white glare of the Utah afternoon, he could see them, fine lines under the skin that were not his veins, branching off his veins, running alongside them like a second system being built inside the first. He called Roy Harlan. The line connected on the first ring. "Roy, I need to discuss what I've found." "Of course." Roy's voice was smooth, too smooth. Roy had a roughness to him, a friction, the voice of a man who'd worked outdoors for 40 years. This voice was Roy's voice the way a photograph is a person, the right shape, but something missing from inside. "What have you found, Garrett?" He noticed Roy had not called him by his first name before. "I think we should meet in person." "I think that would be good," Roy said. "Come to the house." "Are you feeling all right?" A pause, just a moment too long. "I'm feeling better than I have in years," Roy said. Garrett ended the call and sat with the phone in his hands and looked at the ranch house 200 yards away and thought about Roy's handshake at the gate, the grip that measured, the flat planes of Roy's face in the afternoon sun, the coffee that tasted burnt and strong. Roy had been on this land for 11 years. The previous geologist had been here for 3 weeks. Garrett had been here for 47 hours. He opened his field notebook and began to write. Not the data. He'd been writing data for 2 days. He wrote this instead. "The blue light is metabolic. I think it's the light something gives off when it digests. The rock isn't the source. The rock is the medium, the body it moves through. The filament structures are how it moves. They extend through the geological substrate the way mycelium extends through soil. But the analogy breaks down because mycelium breaks down organic material, and this is doing something to inorganic material, to the mineral structure of the rock itself, consuming it at a molecular level and leaving the blue discharge as." He stopped. He looked at what he'd written. The handwriting was his. He recognized the particular slope of his lowercase letters, the way he crossed his sevens. But the last 3 lines were not in English. He didn't know what they were in. He read them and understood them perfectly, which was the worst part by a significant distance. He read them and understood them the way you understand your own thoughts before they become words. He tore the page out, set it on the rock beside him, opened to a fresh page, put his pen to it, and wrote his name, Garrett Cole. That came out correctly. He wrote the date. Correct. He wrote, "The filament structures appear to be." And then the next word was not a word he knew, and he understood it anyway. He folded the torn page without reading it again and put it in his shirt pocket. He became aware of the blue light, faint in the afternoon, but visible if you knew where to look, rising from the ground around him, pulsing, breathing. He became aware of a warmth in his legs, not heat, warmth, the particular warmth of something working, something building. He pulled up his jeans and looked at his calf, and the filaments were there too, visible, running alongside the muscle fibers, and the skin above them had the faintest blue tinge, the same blue as the light rising from the ground, The same blue as the waist of the thing. The same blue as Roy's eyes, he realized. Roy's eyes had not been that color at the gate. He tried to stand. His legs held him, but they felt different. The feedback was slightly wrong, like standing on someone else's legs, like borrowing something that fit well enough but wasn't built for him. He looked out across the depression. The old woman was not at the fence line. The fence line was empty, and beyond it the basin stretched flat and enormous, and the sky over the Uinta Mountains was going red at the edges with the coming dark. He picked up his notebook. He sat back down. He opened to a clean page and wrote, or tried to write, "I need to leave this place," and looked at what came out and read it and understood it completely. The blue came up from the ground around him as the dark came down from the sky above him, breathing, patient, pulsing once every 4 seconds with something he could only call contentment, which was not a geological term, which was not in any methodology, which was not in any reference database. He was still sitting there when the stars came out. He was aware of the blue. He was aware of the warmth in his chest now, something careful and thorough and very, very old, doing its work. He picked up his pen. He wrote, "Field Notes, Day 3B, Frog Ranch, G, Coal, Independent Survey. Sample integrated, substrate viable, extending. New growth, excellent."
If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.